Good evening, everyone. So thank you all for coming out. We'll get started. My name's Dan LeBlanc, and I'm a city councilor here in the city of Regina, and very honored to be able to host the event and introduce our speaker, Jeet Heer. But I want to just begin briefly by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I think it's notable and in some sense ironic that the event we're discussing today is an event about an ongoing genocide in an occupied territory by a colonial government. And it's being introduced by a guy who was elected to a colonial government in an ongoing genocide in the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation and the Treaty 4 territory. I don't have anything clever to say about that, except it feels important to say and to highlight that it's significant that there's ongoing genocides throughout the world and throughout this country and throughout this territory. And there's important work to do to see how these things interrelate. I think the one other comment I want to make is tonight, as I understand it, Jeet is going to be speaking about, in large part, 3 state actors. So the state of Israel, the state of America, and the state of Canada. So it's speaking about these colonial powers that regularly act in what I'll call subject ways. So they influence the world, they act, and they assume that those they're oppressing are objects, not worthy of consideration. It's important to note that even as we speak about state actors today, oppressed people are never objects, they are subjects. There is resistance, there is creativity, there is beauty, there's people on the ground. And even as we focus tonight principally on what state actors are doing to these incredibly valuable subjects, full human beings living in Palestine and Gaza, we need to focus also and have in our hearts and our minds the folks on the ground being affected by these state actors. So thank you for inviting, or rather coming to the event where a colonial representative introduces a talk on Palestine. I want to just introduce Jeet. It's a special treat to have Jeet here with us tonight. He's a brilliant mind with an international reach, and few people know that he actually lives in Regina, so he's a local treasure for us. Yeah. He's the national affairs correspondent with The Nation, a progressive American magazine where he provides a sharp analysis on a wide variety of cultural and political events and topics. Within The Nation, he also hosts a weekly podcast called Time of the Monster, where he interviews a wide range of guests on topics of political and social importance. Look for recent episodes on Gaza, Biden's policies on Israel, and the student movement in solidarity with Palestine. Jeet is also an accomplished author. He has authored and edited several books and comics, as well as literary criticism and political commentary. Just briefly, the structure of the event will be Jeet will speak, he'll do his lecture in the range of 40 to 45 minutes, then we'll have a facilitated question and answer. And the good folks, QP members who work here at the library need us out of here by 9, so we'll comply with that and stop to have everyone home. So please join me in welcoming Jeet.
Okay. First of all, thanks to Dan, not just for that very generous, perhaps too generous introduction, but also for making the event possible tonight. Oh, I should mention there's like 2 seats up front for people who need seats. So I would encourage anyone who wants to sit down to do so. So I won't get too much into the drama of the evening behind the talk and the sponsorship of the talk, except perhaps to say something about public libraries, because I feel like I'm someone who has been educated not just by public schools and public universities, but also by public libraries. I spent much of my life in libraries. Have much of the talk that I'm going to give today is drawn from books that I borrowed from libraries, and I think it's very important to maintain libraries as free public spaces for discussion. That is one of the roles. That's why we, as taxpayers and as citizens, fund and support libraries. They exist as public spaces, and I'm very grateful for this event. For that reason. So, the topic is, I guess, why Biden is supporting Israel the way he is, and then a subsidiary aspect that will come up during the talk is Justin Trudeau as well, or the United States and Canada, if one wants to depersonalize it. But I mean, I think in this issue, Canada shares many similarities with the United States, and it's sort of one of the nations that's following the lead of the United States. And I actually think that that's perhaps one way to perhaps be beginning or thinking about it. Because I think if you look at things like UN votes or what's going on in the international courts, but also just global divide, it is really a divide between the sort of Western countries, the United States and its sort of core allies in Western Europe and Canada, and really the rest of the bloody world, like in terms of like countries that have recognized Palestine or have taken a hard stance, or if you look at the countries that have supported South Africa in the international courts, they include countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, as well as I think what's significant is that we're seeing a shift within the global north. With the South African case, without signing on to the South African case, Spain, Ireland, and Belgium have all had governments that have basically saluted it, saying like, we approve of what South Africa is doing, and that's really reflective of public opinion in the global north. If you look at like any really serious opinion poll, there's a really widespread opposition to what Israel is doing, and that includes within Canada and the United States. And that actually raises like the kind of the first question, or the question I want to use to kind of frame this, because in the United States, it's an election year. Biden is running for re-election. He is the president of the United States. And, one could argue that in many ways, he's acting against his own interest. I mean, as I said, public opinion in the United States was supportive of Israel in the early days, but quickly soured, and especially soured among sort of Democrats. There are polls that show like upward of 75% opposition. So Biden is, carrying through a policy that's, like maybe 3 out of 4 of his voters oppose. And one sees that, in the uncommitted vote that happened in the primaries, and in particular in places like Michigan, which are like swing states, where like there's no way Biden could win without getting out the votes of the people who are like really most adamantly opposed to the war, especially like young people, Arab American, Muslim Americans, and more broadly people of color. And this is one can even see this like hurting him. I'll tell a little like sort of anecdote. I know a friend who's like quite wealthy. Like his family is sort of in the billionaire range. They fund a lot of political magazines. But he's a good guy. But he gets invited, and he shares with me some of the inside stuff. And he gets invited to these because he gives a lot of money to the Democratic Party. And so he shared me this email he got inviting him to an event at the Hamptons with Dr. Jill Biden. But he said, yeah, you'll notice that not only do they not say where the event is, but the people who are hosting the event are not named. Which is to say, like, once you give money to the event, then they will give you the inside information as to where it is and who's hosting it. But even among the sort of plutocratic class of people that are giving parties at the Hamptons, Dr. Jill Biden has to be a little bit in hiding. And one actually sees this in other Biden events. Like, a couple of months ago, Biden was giving an event announcing some student debt relief in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a place that has some colleges, University of, but Biden, the event was not announced ahead of time. It was held in a small public library and not among where he could be facing students, because Biden and his team knew that if they show themselves like publicly at any place, they'll get a lot of public protest. And so I would suggest that politically speaking, it's not a good idea to run for president if you're in the witness protection program. Uh, and so like it's even in that, like you know, like if you're kind of hiding from your own base, that's kind of a problem. But so Biden is like making a real political sacrifice. I mean, the polls are pretty much showing like, I mean, in some ways his policies among the most unpopular policies because there's also hawkish people who oppose him for not going far enough or not, you know, letting Netanyahu finish the job or whatever, however they phrase it. But it's also unpopular among people who oppose him on the other end. But the other way in which it's kind of, one would think it's a kind of self-destructive policy, is, you know, Biden's whole foreign policy project, which is the way that Biden and his team, you know, people like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan conceptualize it is that they're trying to restore the liberal international order. That Trumpism had introduced this element of isolationism or unilateralism, and nobody trusts the U.S. They wanted to rebuild the U.S. as the global international leader, and they thought that they had had some success with that in trying to build a coalition for Ukraine. And guess what? Like, you know, supporting what we're witnessing in Israel has totally undermined that project. And so, like, you know, American diplomats have said, and there's a lot of reporting on this, like when they go to the global south to try to drum up votes in the UN, you know, for their Ukraine policy or to try to get support for sanctions, you know, like people in the global south just like laugh at them. Like you know, like what are you talking about, Putin? When what you're doing in what you're supporting in Israel? And this undermining of foreign policy, you know, I mean, I'm very skeptical of the whole idea of, you know, the liberal international order, but the people within the Biden team really believe in something like this. And one has seen a sort of both internal dissents. There's been a lot of sort of leakage of like dissents within the State Department, where it seems like this policy is very unpopular for the reasons I outlined. It makes the United States look hypocritical and unwilling and unable to get support for anything else it wants to do. But there's also been some resignations, starting with Josh Paul, who was actually the State Department officials in charge of arms deals. And so one would think that someone whose job it is to deal, fine tune the selling of armaments wouldn't have much of a conscience. But this guy said no, he resigned. And I think interestingly, when he said he resigned, he gave interviews where he said, a lot of other people in the State Department would resign, if they had health care. And there was another interesting recent resignation of Lily Greenberg, who, in her resignation, identified herself as the first Jewish member of the Biden administration to resign over this. And she said something very interesting, which I think will reverberate through the talk I'm giving. She said, she's very mad at Biden because he had made Jews the face of the American war machine. And I think that's maybe worth reflecting on, because in thinking about what's going on, I think that there's a bunch of sort of explanations that are, popular and they have some element of truth. There's, talk in the United States about a sort of Israel lobby, and it is true that AIPAC has a lot of money. It's the case that Joe Biden has received throughout his career in the Senate more than $6 million from AIPAC, making him the largest recipient of AIPAC funding. But I mean, AIPAC partially funded him. I mean, Hillary Clinton's number 3 or 4. I mean, they tend to fund people they think are going to be president. And as I think I'll try to show in the lecture, these sort of lobby groups are always subsidiary to the national security interests. The other explanation is a kind of cultural one, and I think it also has an element of truth, which is the sort of the United States is a settler colonial country. They see in Israel a kind of reflection of their own history. So I was in Israel. It's almost 20 years ago, but when I was walking through the West Bank, the whole thing of settlers, it's not even a metaphor. It really felt like the Old West. You saw people carrying rifles and kind of glaring down at the indigenous, occupied people who were being occupied. I mean, it really felt like a full-on old-fashioned settler colonial society, like the Old West. So I think there's an element of truth to that as well. But the explanation that I want to offer forward, I think subsumes that and maybe puts it in some context, and I think is really the most important thing, which is the sort of national security interests of the United States as viewed by its kind of ruling class, and that Israel is, I mean, just thinking about it on a very basic level, like when Bill Clinton was arguing with Netanyahu in the 1990s, at one point he said, who's the fucking superpower here, right? And like the United States, country of 350 million, wealthiest country in the world, spends far more on arms than like the next 10 countries combined. Israel, country of 9 million people, 2 million of whom, in addition to the several million people that are they have under occupation, but many of whom are either of the Arab minority or so it's not like 20% or so it's not like a country like of under 10 million people normally bosses around a country of 350 million people. Like I think that one has to kind of be real and look at the United States and its interests. And I think Biden himself has been very clear on this. And there's a kind of statement that he made in the he's made several times, but going back at least to the 1990s, where he said that $3 billion a year to Israel is the best investment America makes. If Israel didn't exist, America would have to invent an Israel to protect America's interest in the region. And I think that's actually a very accurate statement. I don't like argue with that. And so I think that I'll go back to some prior history to kind of get a setting of this, but I do want to start with this basic premise that Biden has a light of it. This is actually a bargain. And I said 3 billion. Now, with the war going on, it's like, upwards 20 billion or whatever. But it's still like from Biden's point of view, this is a bargain. And I'll get into like why it might be considered a bargain. And I mean, like to talk about we'll go into like the broader history of sort of Israel in a moment, but like in just sort of setting out what is America's interest in the region. Like I don't think one should be naive here. Now I'm just going to quote a 1945 State Department memo, which said that the oil reserves in the Middle East are, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. And again, like I don't dispute that. The other quote that sort of along this line, and to maintain to access to that, one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the United States has supported not just Israel, but has supported a range of autocracies in the Middle East. Most notably the regime in Saudi Arabia and other Arab monarchies, but also since the late 1970s, the Egyptian military dictatorship. It used to support the Shah before the Iranian Revolution. And in fact, the United States in 1953, along with their allies, the British, staged a coup d'etat in Iran because at that point, Iran had a democratically elected leader, Mohammed Mossadegh, who nationalized the oil as actually like not even American oil. And this is important. Like for America, it's like it's not like they necessarily want the oil for themselves. They want the oil for themselves and their allies. It's like British Petroleum was the main investor. So the Americans, MI6 and the CIA staged a coup. And I have to quote from later this 1953, the CIA did an internal history of this coup, and in describing it, it said about the coup, it was a day that should have never ended, for it carried with it such a sense of excitement, of satisfaction, and of jubilation that it's doubtful whether any other can come up to it. So from the CIA's own internal records, it's like, this is the greatest day in human history when we were able to like get rid of a democratically elected government and install a monarchy that was of the Shah of Iran that was subservient. And so America has these like imperial material interests in the region. But I want to turn back to the whole issue of how Israel kind of fits into this. And Zionism as a project started in the 19th century as a reaction to something that was very real, and which one would see play itself out in the most horrific form, which is European anti-Semitism. The project was based on the idea of getting that the solution to anti-Semitism was the creation of a Jewish homeland. And the late 19th century, was a period of, full throttle imperialism, unabashed imperialism of, like the sort of settlements of South Africa, Rhodesia, or, here in Canada, what everyone is familiar with what happened to Louis Riel. And so within that context, the early Zionists saw themselves as saying, like, well, other people are building these settler colonial societies, like, why can't we? And and within Zionism, there was always like a spectrum of opinion between the sort of socialist Zionism of David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, and the what was called revisionist Zionism of Vladimir Jabotinsky, which was a much more hardline, and it was the sort of ideological father of what we see with Netanyahu. But even within these groups, like the sort of division was not that great. But even the sort of left Zionists talked about settler colonialism. There's an Israeli historian, Benny Morris, who comes out of the late tradition of labor Zionism, and he's very clear that like this is a project of ethnic cleansing, and says that Ben Gurion in the 1930s endorsed the idea of transferring or expelling Arabs to create a Jewish state. And the obviously Jabotinsky was like much more even forthright about this, saying that basically comparing the Arabs to the indigenous people of North America or the Aztecs in Mexico, and saying that Jewish colonization to be successful must be, quote, carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. Now, if you're going to do this sort of colonial project in defiance of the sort of native population, you kind of need allies. And it was the case that with the earliest theoretization of Zionism by people like Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, the project was based on the idea that we would need an imperial sponsor. We would need some greater big power to back us up. And it's actually very interesting to look at the early Zionists, where they actually tried a bunch of different to find different sponsors, including at one point the Ottoman Empire, but also France, and eventually selling upon Great Britain. With this was like in the period of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire, was really like in a state of collapse, and Britain was taking over a lot of the imperial role in the region. And they famously got Arthur Balfour to make a declaration of support with the idea of a Jewish state. Now, there's two things to make about points to kind of make about this, which is one is that the British support was always, as often with the British Empire, a little bit two-faced. Like they often, as in many regions, would try to say different things to different parties to placate them, very similar to their policies in India with regard to Hindus and Muslims. And so they were basically over-promising, like promising things to both the Arabs and Israelis. And the other aspect of Balfour, which I think is worth noting, is he was an anti-Semite. He thought that these immigrant Jews who are coming in because of the pogroms, they're coming from Russia, would like form labor unions. It would undermine British society, and so that Israel for him was a solution, not just for the suffering of Jews through European anti-Semitism, but also helping European society not to have people he regarded as troublesome. And I just want to quote a memo from 1919 from Balfour, which kind of captures the spirit of this sort of imperial project. In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-old tradition, and that is profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. And in 1937, they had the British had appeal commission because fighting had broken out between the Jewish settlers and Arabs. And Winston Churchill, made a statement there, which again captures the sort of thinking that's involved here. And in supporting the idea of building a Jewish state in Israel, Churchill said, I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong was done to the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong was done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any rate, a more worldly wise race, put it that way, and has come in and taken their place. So this is when we talk about sort of settler colonialism, this is the kind of mentality or thinking that is at work. And I mean, one occasion hears controversies about this, but if you actually look at the historical record, at least prior to the sort of 1950s, this is it, but even sometimes well into the 1950s, but certainly before then, this is just a pervasive part of the record that the Arab population that was already living in Israel, they are of the same status as the indigenous people of Canada or the United States or elsewhere in the world. That they are people who have to get out of the way for a higher grade people to get in. And I just put Louis Brandeis, a very famous American jurist, writing to Felix Frankfurter, who was a Supreme Court justice in 1927. And then they were both strong supporters of this project. And Brandeis said, as against the Bedouins, our pioneers, meaning the Jewish settlers in the region, our pioneers are in a position not unlike the American settlers against the Indians. So this was the kind of settler colonial mentality that was going in there. Now, obviously, the Second World War and the Holocaust and sort of European anti-Semitism, coming to its really horrific conclusion, made all the issues of Jewish settlement in the Middle East more salient and more pertinent. And the only thing I would add to that, though, is that one cannot understand this story without understanding the anti-Semitism of the countries that supported the creation of Israel. And I had mentioned, Balfour's attitude that he wanted the Jewish state so that there would not be Jews in England. It is absolutely the case that with it starting in the 1920s, there's a strong nativist reaction throughout the Western countries with very anti-Semitic immigration laws. Famously, the head of Canadian immigration under Mackenzie King, during the period of the Shoah, the destruction of the European Jews, he famously said, asked how many Jewish immigrants Canada should take. None is too many. And this attitude, one would think, would have terminated with the Holocaust. But actually, if you actually look at public opinion polls in Canada, and this is perhaps we're highlighting the old anti-Semitism did not die. And public opinion polls in Canada, well into the late 40s and early 50s, showed that Jews were among the least desired immigrants by the Canadian population as a whole, and the Germans, even though Canada had fought a war against Germany, were regarded as much better immigrants. And certainly, for Cold War reasons, as some of you will know, Canada admitted not just Germans, but perhaps the worst sort of Germans and other people from Eastern Europe, people who had been in the Waffen SS, who were admitted in because they were seen as admirable anti-communist and in keeping with Canadian values. So within the context of a Western society that had committed a horrific anti-Semitic crime with the Holocaust, and where anti-Semitic attitudes were still pervasive, the support for Israel was seen as a logical kind of solution, and it's partially a logical solution because there was that attitude that, like as Churchill said, well, they don't have any more rights than the Red Indians of America or the Black people of Australia. The Now, within that period, there were people who realized that 67 to 73 is the real formation of the American-Israeli alliance. And I think that one has to understand it in the context of the larger problems the United States was having. This was, of course, during the time of the Vietnam War. 67 was a period where America was already, a lot of the people within the American ruling elite, like Robert McNamara, the war was lost. It was just briefly before the Tet Offensive really made that clear. And it was a period where the United States was facing increasing opposition from the global South. And within that context, the fact that Israel was able to rout its neighbors and have a really effective military was very attractive. First to the Johnson administration, and then especially Nixon and Kissinger, where they saw that this is a state that could really do their bidding, that could do the act as the sort of bad cop of empire, act as the force that can really push back against Arab nationalism and really show a ferocious face that could restrain it. I just quote from an article in Jacobin, but this is the period where they start to spend, not before 67, the American spending on Israel was very minimal. But after 67, it became, tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, and then finally billions. And this article in Jacobin says, no price tag was too high for what the United States got of the deal. An indigenous intelligence service, the Mossad, troops trained and familiar with the territory and ideologically committed, all the weapons they could ever need there in the Middle East. And that also, unlike in Vietnam, you're getting, Israeli troops fighting your war for you, not American troops. So you don't have to worry about the domestic cost. And this article suggests that, a conservative estimate of the value of this was could be 125 billion, but getting it for just a few hundred million or even a few billion is a big deal. And it's also a kind of big deal, not just for the sort of military might, but also that Israel becomes a kind of testing ground and selling ground for American weapons. That if America is supplying Israel with these weapons and it is subduing its neighbors, then you can both have a country that you're selling it to. A lot of the American spending on Israel has been circular. It's like you give money to Israel so Israel can buy weapon systems from the United States. Companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, will obviously profit from that. Now, so within that period, I think that you see the sort of real kind of formation of the alliance. There are but it's never been a static thing. That there has been ongoing project for the United States to maintain dominance, but it has experienced real setbacks. Now, in the sort of, I mentioned earlier the coup in Iran in '53, and after the coup, the Shah of Iran and Iran, enormously oil-rich country, were one of the pillars of American power. And even though the Shah was ostensibly an Islamic leader and ostensibly supported the Palestinians and ostensibly didn't recognize Israel, in fact, the Iranian government and Israel had really strong covert ties, especially ties of intelligence, where the sort of SAVAK, the Iranian intelligence, and Mossad often work together on operations. Now, in the late '70s, there was a revolution in Iran, initially a secular one, and eventually took a religious turn, became the Islamic Republic, and turned against the United States. And so that was an enormous kind of setback for the United States. But conversely, with Egypt, And I think Egypt kind of shows the real value of Israel. That Israel had defeated Israel in 2 wars in '67 and '73, and this really marked the end of Egypt as being a sort of plausible leader of a secular Arab nationalism that was an alternative to the American hegemony in the region, which was the sort of project that Nasser had set upon. And you started to get within the Egyptian military, Egyptian ruling class, a turn against that sort of model, which was also a model of redistribution. Like Nasser was trying to take the money from the Suez Canal to do like sort of domestic development. By the late 1970s, the defeated Egyptian military said, "Well, we need all this American weapons. The Israelis are defeating us," and so under Anwar Sadat, you had on the one hand a kind of peace deal with Israel, famously negotiated by Jimmy Carter. But the sort of downside of that was that it led to this kind of military government in Egypt that really turned its back on the entire Nasserite project, the project of both sort of Arab nationalism, regional development, domestic redistribution, and became a really garden variety military state. I just want to maybe take the emphasize then that who the sort of partners are and who the friends and enemies are can kind of change. Like one saw there sort of Iran and Egypt kind of switching places, and Saudi Arabia and Israel had for many decades even though they were both American allies, had a kind of unfriendly relationship, especially with the sort of Saudi devotion to a very extreme puritanical form of Islam, and they're a real ideological opponent opposition. But I think that in the early 1980s, when the U.S. wanted to sell military weapons to Saudi Arabia, there was a lot of Israeli opposition to that, and this is kind of crucial. Even though there was Israeli opposition and the Israeli lobby in the U.S. opposed, at the end of the day, the national security state gets what it wants, and they were able to do this. And the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia deepened, and this deepening has really grown stronger, and there's been an interesting kind of development since the failed project of George W. Bush with the war on terror. You remember after 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, set up their own governments, and that sort of project, has basically it was largely unsuccessful. And one of the reasons it's unsuccessful is that, from the point of view of just of American power, is that it enormously strengthened Iran. Iran was able to really become a kind of leader within the region because it was seen. It had many friends that came to the fore, especially in Iraq, but also throughout the region. And so the rise of Iran as the sort of major American foe has created a new configuration of the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, not just being loose allies, but really drawing closer together. And this was especially encouraged really after the Arab Spring and the sort of which really scared a lot of the Arab autocrats in the region, and which the sort of conspiratorially, I think, saw Iran as the kind of one of the hidden hands behind this, and really these kind of the former hostility between Saudi Arabia and Israel has really disappeared, and this has created for the United States a new opportunity to assert its hegemony in a period where it really has suffered a real material defeat in the sort of what happened in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where they were not able to impose their will the way they thought they were. But because of the failure of the sort of war on terror strategy, Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Egyptian military, which was able to crush the domestic democracy movement within their own country, they've all grown really closer together. And one saw this under this has become a really bipartisan project. Under Trump, it was known as the Abraham Accord, and the idea is that one would build an alliance, get the recognition, Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel, get Israel and Saudi Arabia to be working together on regional trade pacts, and then that these two powers, along with the Egyptian military state, could become the real bulwarks of American power. And Trump has really pushed that, and Biden, initially came in critical of Saudi Arabia, but he has sort of lapsed back into that, and that has really become the sort of fulcrum or push of this. And I have to say, so when people ask, like, why is the U.S. supporting Israel despite all the obvious disadvantages? I think the real question one could also ask, and I think it highlights the issue of like why they're supporting Israel, is why are they supporting Saudi Arabia? I think that I don't know how many people here watch 60 Minutes, but there was a report on 60 Minutes just last weekend about this sort of like legal case that's going through with some of the families of the 9/11 terrorist attack. And it's long been known that there was a sort of some elements of the Saudi intelligence state had some ties with both bin Laden and the 9/11 hijackers. I mean, 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden himself, although never formally tied to the United States, worked within the Saudi regime as a part of a back channel or for getting Saudi arms into Afghanistan. That's how bin Laden became the figure that he was. And the report on 60 Minutes, this is an ongoing legal case, and more documents are coming to discovery. And they found some amazing documents of people within the Saudi embassy, who had made contact with the 9/11 hijackers, two of them before, were showing them around, like getting them driver's licenses, getting them like apartments, shooting a video of Washington D.C. where they went around Washington D.C. saying, here's the Pentagon, here's the here's the Lincoln, I don't know, maybe it's just tourism. But if you think about it in those terms, like if the United States has never been willing to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, one could argue, well, and in fact, after 9/11, none of the people in the Saudi intelligence who were involved with were ever reprimanded. But they now argue, well, under the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, well, things have changed and he's a domestic reformer. But I gotta say, like the Crown Prince, like, he orchestrated the kidnapping of an American permanent resident in Turkey where they dismembered him. Like, I don't think this is a good guy. And I don't think that the idea of building an alliance system with this guy, of the security system, where the goal of Saudi Arabia, and they're very explicit, is they want to become a nuclear power. So Biden's whole foreign policy, this, everything that we're seeing is geared towards the idea that, well, we have to uphold the Abraham Accords, so we will support Israel, so they will be on board when we want to do the Abraham Accords. And, like, do you want to give nuclear weapons to this, like, monarchy that is like a really vicious dictatorship, kills people, like, abroad, and also is, like, totally reliant on, like, the sort of fossil fuel, which, for the sake of the preventing human extinction, we actually have to stop using. Like that does not seem to me like a stable country that one would want to make the bulwark of one's power base. But nor like Israel, like like this kind of settler colonial project, which has increasingly had to resort to like really horrific violence to maintain itself. Like that does not seem like a stable basis, like for an alliance system. But I think really the key here is the sort of desperation of the United States, that especially after the defeats in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and also the American view that, like, they're in an era of great power competition with China and Russia, and therefore a lot of this is based on the idea, well, we need these regional regimes, unpleasant as they may be, because they will carry out our activities in the region, and so we can concentrate, on the real project, which is, like fighting, preparing for war with Russia and China, which also doesn't seem to me like a great idea. But so all of which is to say, like, when people, I mean, I think that, Israel has done like a lot of horrific things, but I think it's important to see Israel within the framework of American empire. And what has often been, especially since that period of 67 to 73, when it really became a linchpin of American imperial projection, Israel has been the state that does the dirty work of empire. And one saw this in the 1980s, where, like, for domestic reasons, because of congressional opposition, even the Reagan administration couldn't give full throttle support to the regime in Guatemala that was committing genocide against the indigenous people. But Israel was able to supply the arms and then be the kind of back channel. And the same with South Africa. Even under Reagan administration, there's congressional opposition to American support for South Africa, and Israel was the country that could do the dirty work that the American regime needed to be done, but needed like maybe clean hands on. And I think that maybe explains really the issue of why the United States, but also Canada, which is part of this imperial system, has as Dan mentioned, this history of settler colonialism, has these ideological affinities and geopolitical ties, like why these two countries have pursued the policies that they have. Okay, so I'll call it close to that.